Hello, everyone. Welcome on into onesoccer.ca. Andy Petrillo, Gareth Wheeler, Oliver Platt with you. I just saw you guys a few hours ago, for crying out loud. We had a late one last night, 10 p.m. kickoff in that game between the Vancouver Whitecaps, Valour FC, and what? That's right. If you've been watching, you know it's the 15th edition of the Canadian Championship. That kicked off Tuesday, Wednesday night. We had a triple header Tuesday. We had a double header Wednesday, preliminary round. And gentlemen, we now know our quarter-final matchup. So we're going to go through each of them. You tell me what intrigues you about that matchup and perhaps who you're even favoring to go through. I know we've done our predictions, but now that we've seen certain teams in action, maybe your opinion has changed on the matchup. So let's begin. The Vancouver Whitecaps exorcise that CPL demon, at least against Valour. So they get the victory. They move on. They will now face Cavalry, the team that defeated them at the 2019 Canadian Championship. Wheels, I'll begin with you. What intrigues you about this matchup?
First of all, kudos to Vancouver and their manager, Vanni Sartini, like achievement granted, beating a CPL club. I thought that was, honestly, it showed some real levity and it was funny post-match. So good on them. It just depends the state of these two teams ahead of the game in 2 weeks' time. I've kind of boasted about what I think about Cavalry, well-rounded team, well-coached team, difficult to break down under Tommy Wheeldon Jr. They're dealing with a bunch of injuries right now, and if it gets much deeper, then whatever team he puts out can look very different. The Whitecaps are blessed with a much deeper side. They're going to be the favorite heading into this game as well, and I think they just kind of needed to show that little bit more impetus in this competition like they showed last night. I just don't think after the first half an hour of the game against Valour, the game was really in doubt. That's the way that things should be with MLS teams. Ollie documented it in a board last night, just the discrepancy in terms of payrolls, the demands of, one league playing under 21 players, another league kind of that not being a priority. So the Vancouver Whitecaps should be in a position to go on and do something. I think it was a good performance for them. It was comfortable. It was easy at times against Valour. I'm not expecting it to be that straightforward against Cavalry, but Whitecaps have to be considered the favorite going into this next round.
They're the favourites, but this is a much more difficult proposition for them, I think, than hosting Valour. Vancouver is 0-5 on the road this season. It's been a complete non-starter for them in MLS in terms of getting points. And you're facing a much more experienced Cavalry team than I think that Valour team, particularly without some of their key players that they were missing last night, that knows how to play in these types of games. I know it was, a couple of years ago now, 3 years ago now nearly, that they knocked Vancouver out of the Canadian Championship, but there's still some of the same faces in this team, and crucially, obviously, the same guy on the bench in Tommy Wheeldon Jr., who I think knows how to approach games against this Vancouver team that doesn't like to play the game in certain ways, doesn't always like to have a lot of the ball, can be prone to counterattacks in that way, as we've seen in some of their road games so far this season. So it's going to be a lot more complicated for Vancouver. But that being said, Wheels is right. You just look at this Cavalry team right now with the injuries they have, with the bench they had against FC Edmonton in the first round. It's a difficult situation for them at the minute. They're playing quite well, I think, despite that. But they really can't afford to lose any more bodies, and ideally they need 2 or 3 bodies back. And we talked about FC Edmonton coming into that game and being a lot stronger in the second half. Well, part of that I think you have to put down to the fact that in a midweek game, having just played off the weekends, Cavalry did not really have a lot to go to on their bench to kind of refresh their lineup and put some legs in that team. So that could be something that's an issue for them. The game's only obviously 2 weeks away. They need to get a few faces back or even bring some in, I think, to have the best chance here.
And when I look at it, Andy, sorry, really quickly here, just the schedule is going to count. Cavalry plays at home on that weekend before against Valour. Vancouver's away to Charlotte, I believe. On top of that, I think Cavalry is the better goalkeeper. I think the back lines for this team, I think it's a little bit of a wash. I think the midfield is going to be really key here. And I think it's going to be a really good contest in the middle of the park as well. So Vancouver Whitecaps aren't head and heels above Cavalry in terms of quality, maybe even a little bit more up top, but at least on paper, maybe not. We'll see in practice about how the way that this actually plays out.
Well, I was going to bring up schedule because obviously it matters as well what they're doing in their league. And we talked about it yesterday. Vancouver actually has 2 home games, I think, before they play, the quarterfinal. And if they don't have to do that kind of travel, if they can rest up some bodies, and then we'll see what things look like for Tommy Wheeldon Jr. in 2 weeks' time if he gets any bodies back. But then he too has to balance with the CPL schedule, right? This is where it starts to get tricky. Yeah. So we just don't know what we're going to see come the May 24th, 26th. That's the window for the quarterfinals. Another matchup that we saw. So Pacific earned a bye into the quarterfinals, being the CPL champions. They will now face York United. York United defeating Atletico Ottawa in the preliminary round in penalty kicks, 8-7. Ollie, what intrigues you about this matchup?
What intrigues me is something I just noticed this morning looking at this matchup is that York are going to play Pacific away twice in a row, which adds another layer to this game. They've got a league game at Starlight Stadium a few days before, and then the cup game. And so that makes it, I think, a bit more complicated for Pacific in that they have to, game plan to beat this York United team twice. York gets to take a look at them and maybe learn a few lessons from the league game and then try and apply those in the cup match. So that could go either way. It'll be interesting to see how Martin Nash approaches it in terms of, does he save some things for the cup game, or is it all in for the league game because he wants those points? That's always a weird dynamic, I think, for the coaches to try and handle. So, but for me in this one, I said last night, this has to be a really big competition for York United because of the way the bracket has come out and the potential for them to go on a little bit of a run here. I think could be really, really good for the club and something that helps to get a bit of attention on a club that needs it. I do think in this game, Pacific is the favourites. They've just looked like a really difficult team to get anything from at Starlight Stadium this season. Even when I felt they haven't actually quite been at their best, they've still found ways to win games. They've got so much firepower up front, and that front three is in particular, plus Manny Aparicio, is really clicking. So it's going to be a big ask for York United, and especially when they have to do it twice in a week.
What are you smirking at, Gareth? What are you smirking at? Hey, you know what? Watch this. I may have chosen Cavalry to go to the final, but if Pacific ends up going and Aparicio gets MVP, you're all going to be eating your shoes. I'm just saying. I'm just saying.
You've already changed it. You're already out.
Carry on.
To Ollie's point about Starlight, last time York was at Starlight Stadium, they beat Pacific in the run in last season in a crazy game with the sendings off. It was a crazy game. But overall, over the course of their brief histories, York United have a better record against Pacific. 4 wins, 3 draws, 2 losses over the course of 9 games played. So York United has played Pacific well. You saw the body language from York United, what that win over Atletico Ottawa meant to them. I'm not quite there to call them a team of destiny yet, but this matters to them. Like, they're fully committed to this competition, and York United have got off to a really good start to the season. Like, I was always questioning whether the young players were ready to step up. They look like they're ready to step up, and they have their anchors and Jordan Wilson and Dominic Zator to help this team through difficult moments. They have 2 good strikers in attack in Wright and De Rosario. I think this is a team that can do some damage. Now, you're right, Ollie. They're going to have to go to the most difficult place in the Canadian Premier League right now and probably play against the deepest and best team on the books right now with all due respect to Forge. Like, Pacific is that good. They're balanced, and it's going to be a real game. I think this could be one of the highlight draws of this entire tournament. And yes, it's Canadian Premier League team playing against Canadian Premier League team, but I think that provides a little bit of an element of intrigue as well. And yeah, I think this one could be, I think it's more of a coin toss than I think that we might be initially giving it on first glance.
All right, another quarterfinal matchup. We see Toronto FC also earned a bye to the quarterfinals because they were last year's the Canadian Championship finalist, losing out to CF Montreal. We'll get to that matchup in just a moment. And this is going to be the 3rd CPL team, gentlemen, that Toronto FC is facing, because last year they beat York in the quarters, then they beat Pacific in the semis to ultimately face CF Montreal in the final. So now they get a taste of Halifax, and they will actually play in Halifax. Take us through this matchup, Gareth.
Yeah. First off, it's going to be the Schaffelberg family reunion, by the way, in Halifax. My guy, Jacob Schaffelberg, going back to Nova Scotia. And other than he and Antti Jazic, like, I don't think many players have come through Nova Scotia and played at the highest level. So that's going to be a special night for him and his family. I don't think the TFC will hate this draw. The fact that they don't have to play on, a bad surface at Guelph University Stadium. They're going to play on a natural surface in Halifax with a good atmosphere, a good environment. And that's going to be the big talking point coming into this game. The question is, once they get on the field, what's the path to victory for Halifax? And I have a hard time coming up with an answer here, which ends up with them beating Toronto FC. Look, they lose Morelli for the season. I think that this Halifax team have been rock solid all season long. Their game model's been good. Aiden Daniels has looked the part. I think that Andre Rampersad is completely underappreciated in terms of what he means for his team. But when you're going up against potentially the likes of Pozuelo, Jimenez, Bradley, Osorio, if he's back in the team, Salcedo, it's going to be a tough game for Halifax. TFC just naturally have more firepower. Perhaps the environment will turn out something like Starlight last season, Pacific, and the Whitecaps. TFC need to show up. I think they'll prioritize this tournament. It's always meant something to them. I don't think they're going to play a weakened side. I just have a hard time figuring out a way that Halifax wins this game. Perhaps Ollie has the path to victory in his head.
The path to victory, I think, is like any cup tie of this nature. It's that Halifax comes out and looks a bit hungrier and like they want the tie a little bit more than Toronto FC do. And there's some players on Toronto FC that you don't worry about that kind of aspect, and they're going to be up for it and they're probably going to quite enjoy it. But then there's probably one or two where you do wonder, how are they going to approach this game, and are they going to come into a small stadium and really have the same kind of energy and application in their game that we know the Wanderers will. And the other thing I think you have to look at with this tie is that Halifax maybe look a bit more like a Valour, a mid-table Canadian Premier League team, and those generally haven't had the same success that the Cavalry and Forge and Pacific have had in terms of taking on the MLS opponents. But Halifax at the Wanderers grounds are a very good team. There's been a big contrast between their home and road records. They were pretty much as good as Cavalry, Pacific, and Forge in terms of their home record last season in the Canadian Premier League. I think they were 1 point behind a couple of them, 2 points behind the other one. So it's a difficult place to go. We know the fans are going to be looking forward to this one. We know they're going to create a wonderful atmosphere in that stadium, and teams do respond to that. So I think a lot of it does come down to Toronto FC. If their minds are right, if their appetite for the game is right, if they're organized and apply themselves in the proper way, yes, they should have the quality to win this game. But if there's one or two weak links in that team, and we know that could certainly be the case last year. It's been better this year, to be fair to Bob Bradley, in terms of the way he started rebuilding the roster. But if there's any danger of that opens the door, I think, for a team like Halifax to come in and cause an upset.
Let's get to our final matchup, and it's a rematch from what we saw last year in the semis, and that would be Forge, two-time CPL champs, taking on CF Montreal, who have won the last two Canadian championship titles. So Gareth, when you look at this matchup, do you feel we could see an upset here?
Potentially. It all depends on Wilfred Nancy. Does he play a full side? Understand they play on the weekend against Real Salt Lake. They play Cincinnati after. Those are two games, both at home, by the way, that sandwich that Forge game that they'll feel like they can go to win. And right now I feel like the priority, and not to take anything away from the Canadian Championship, because I always think they should play a side that can win. But I just feel right now they are a team that's in contention for the MLS Cup. Last year, when things were a little bit more dicey for Montreal and you're trying to balance that run in and try to punch their playoff ticket, Wilfred Nancy went to Tim Hortons Field and played a second team for that game, largely. And it almost ended up costing them in the end as the game went to 11 shooters and they survived the penalty shootout thanks to Sebastian Breza. So Forge is a good team right now. I'm really impressed with their attack. I think they can cause some problems for a Montreal back line, especially if there is some rotation in the team. Where I'm a little bit leery about Forge right now is what their back line looks like. Health issues when it comes to Crutzen. He hasn't played yet. Johnny Grant can't seem to play in the team. Good to see Ashton Morgan back out there. Sissoko picked up a knock last night. He's been playing as a de facto right back. They've been playing Ashinyoti Janssen at center back as well. It's been a little bit patchwork from Bobby Smirniota. So what does that back line look like going into Montreal? You need to be able to defend well.
By the way, isn't
in
this
these
crazy what
CPL
we're
games.
sorry, I'm just
Yeah,
like what we're looking at right now. It went the distance last year. The goalkeepers taking kicks. That's what it took for Montreal to beat Forge, by the way.
heartbreak, and they were that close. And on the balance, I think Forge was a better team that night. So I think a lot of it depends on what that Forge back line looks like, who's available, because the path to victory for them, defend well and then use their attacking players to play on the counter attack. And Forge certainly has some players that can punish the CF Montreal back line. So I do think they have a puncher's chance here.
It's got to be a hard one to look back on if you're Forge, right? Like
Oh
they
yeah.
were so close. They were the better team in that game during 90 minutes, and then you would have been going to a final against TFC, who at that stage in the season were just kind of, basically on the beach, right? Like there was the whole Altidore situation where he didn't even play in that game. Their performance in the final was really poor. It was a really one-sided game. You just wonder what might have been. I think it's going to be a lot more difficult for them this time, to be honest with you. I compare it, like we didn't really give Forge much of a chance of beating Cruz Azul in the Champions League. I think this is a tie of similar difficulty, to be honest. I think the CF Montreal team is really, really good. Yes, they could make some changes, but I think they will have learned their lesson from last year in not making too many. And I also think this team right now is just a bit better built to make a few changes and still be really strong. They played the weekend game against Orlando without Wanyama, without Ismail Kone, new central midfield pairing, still won the game 4-1. So particularly having home advantage, I think at Stade Saputo, I have a hard time seeing past this Montreal team 2 weeks away, the way they're playing. There's plenty of time to go in the MLS season, so I don't think this competition will be too much of kind of just seen as a distraction. And Forge are at that stage early in their season where it feels like they're still kind of just building to being the team they want to be when it comes to September, October. I don't think they're quite at the same level as they were when they played this game last season. So, look, it's Forge. They've got great knockout experience. They're a brilliant team at their best, so they'll always go in with a chance. But I do think Montreal should be favoured, maybe more so than last year in this one.
They're not as fatigued either, Ollie Forge, because they were playing
True.
a game every 4 days last year. So this
Yeah.
team's going to be fresher, maybe in a better position to go out and do something here. And look, there's a lot of players from the province of Quebec in this Forge team. So there's a familiarity to Montreal. There's an understanding of what that club means. Chouanière v. Chouanière, potentially. We didn't get Gutierrez v. Gutierrez last night in Whitecaps, and Valour might get the Chouanières head-to-head for this matchup too.
All right, so those are your quarterfinal matchups, but I do want, and I understand, gentlemen, that we're in the preliminary stage, and typically in any kind of tournament, whether it's the preliminary round robin, usually fans start to trickle on in, and it really starts to build when you hit the semis and then the finals. But do you think for a tournament that's been around since 2008, this is the 15th edition, it's the national title. Gareth, do you think the Canadian Championship, which has grown from 3 teams to now 13 teams from 4 different leagues, gets the respect it deserves?
What does it deserve? That's the question. And for me, when you're playing for a national championship, it deserves attention. It deserves profile. It deserves support. Do I think this tournament gets it? Yes. But what we've known for quite some time in this country is, from a national profile, other than your friends at One Soccer and another, limited amount of outlets, like people just don't look at this event. It's been like that year over year after year in a congested, national sporting calendar. What I think is crystal clear what needs to happen to get attendance up, and I think that's what matters the most, it's just about community outreach. It's about the local clubs doing more to put a footprint in their community and making sure that people are aware that people want to come out, and have that relationship with the players, the club, the team, the fans, and everything that goes, that's part of supporting a club. Like junior hockey is the model in this country where these junior hockey clubs are well supported. They might not be playing in as big stadium as the soccer teams are, but that's the model. That's the feel that you want to have, and I'm not quite sure that we're there, that we're there yet. I think that the clubs need to do more work with the local, youth soccer associations to make sure that on game nights that maybe that's a night that there's a bye week and that cheap tickets are distributed to these clubs to allow young players to come in and get that taste, have that experience, being in the crowd for a big Canadian championship game. That's just one idea, Andy. Certainly there's more we can do across the board, but I think the onus for these local clubs to be successful, everything needs to be hyper local and they need to mean something to the people that live there.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And it sometimes frustrates me when we say, oh, the Canadian Championship's so great and the Canadian Premier League's so great. Why don't more people show up, as if like they should just kind of discover it and without us really doing any work, right? Like we need to be in the communities, telling the stories of these teams, telling the story of the sport in this country, building that connection. That you want to support your local team in a national competition, right? Where in some cases you've got smaller markets going up against the Torontos and Vancouvers and Montreals, and that can be a really exciting thing. So we've got to keep doing that. It is still, as much as the Canadian Championship has been around for a little while now, the CPL has only been around since 2019, and we've had 2 years massively interrupted by pandemic, obviously. So we're still in the very, very early stages of having a competition where it really is a truly national competition with multiple, markets across the country, and building those rivalries and those storylines. So we got to keep doing that, and hopefully now we're starting to get back to more of a normal reality. We can continue to see that grow.
I'm hearing road trip in the future for One Soccer. Let's just go to the different markets.
Yes.
Let's just hold our pub nights. I'm A-okay with that. I want
more teams the better as well. Once we get up to 16, it's going to be a well-rounded tournament, right? So I feel like that the Canadian Championship is just hitting its stride, and the Voyageurs Cup is going to become more important each and every year. That's the direction we're going.